took her back outside, still no clothing on from the waist down.
How painful would that injury have been?
Very painful.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Christopher Collings, guilty of murder in the first degree.
Who appeared in court in Cassville in Berry County, Missouri. The two were arrested on Monday, 3 days after Rowan Ford's body was found about 10 miles from her home. According to investigators, both men have admitted taking part in the crime, but today in court entered pleas of not guilty. Today, Spears and Collins were heavily guarded, wearing both wrist and leg shackles. Ford's mother, Colleen Spears, was also in court today, joined by several family members. While many in the community of Stella continue to grieve and hope for justice, they did not attend court proceedings this morning.
November 9th, 2007, in Missouri. For several days, the search for a missing child was ongoing. On November 3rd, a 9-year-old girl disappeared from her own bedroom, and the small community of Stella, where it happened, was thrown into a state of deep fear and tense waiting. There were no clear leads at all, and no one really knew where she was or what might have happened to her. Everything felt uncertain, just hanging in the air, until a tip finally came in. Officers were told to check an area near Fox Cave in McDonald County. Fox Cave wasn't really a cave in the traditional sense, more like a sinkhole, about 30 feet from the road, tucked away in a heavily wooded area. Deputies Mike Hall and Jake B.S. went there to carry out a search. About 20 feet underground, on a rocky ledge, they discovered signs of an incredibly tragic event, one that confirmed the community's worst fears. Stella, Missouri, had a population of fewer than 200 people. One of the children who called this place home was Rowan Ford. 9-year-old Rowan was born on April 11th, 1998. She was in 4th grade and was known as a hard-working, cheerful kid. Rowan loved reading and drawing, and she enjoyed being outside, riding her bike, and just being in the fresh air. Church meant a lot to her. She would often get up early to help the pastor prepare, and when he arrived, she usually sat on the steps, smiling so genuinely. Rowan attended Sunday school and took part in the Angel Food Ministries program. She absolutely loved Barbie, and her pink bedroom fully reflected that love. Like everything about it, said Barbie. Still, Rowan's everyday life wasn't always easy. Sometimes her appearance hinted that she wasn't getting the care she really needed. Her hair was often unkempt, and on cold Missouri winter days, she would sometimes come to school without proper clothing. Even so, Rowan was an incredibly responsible student, and her teachers truly enjoyed working with her. She always put in her best effort, even in subjects that were tough for her, like math. One teacher said Rowan was a real ray of sunshine. Honestly, one of the sweetest kids you could ever meet. Rowan was the youngest of 5 children. She was shy and often stayed close to her older sister, but when she finally felt comfortable, it was like the whole room just warmed up. Her sister later remembered, Rowan really was someone special. She had this rare ability to make people genuinely care about her. Like anyone who spent time with her just felt an instant connection. A kind of warmth that stayed with you. She lived with her mother, Colleen, who was 44 years old, and her stepfather, David Spears, who was 25. David wasn't just her stepfather, though. He was also her biological father. Back in 2005, a court ordered him to pay child support in the amount of $29. Still, it was never really clear how involved he actually was in Rowan's life. Like how present he truly was day to day. Colleen worked at Walmart, and every time she came home from a shift, Rowan would rush outside, running into the yard just so she could be the first one to greet her mum. She always wanted to hear how her day went, almost like that little moment mattered more to her than anything else. But Rowan wasn't there. Colleen went inside the house, thinking maybe Rowan was in her bedroom, probably lost in a book like she so often was. But she wasn't there either. Rowan wasn't anywhere in the house. That's when Colleen asked her husband, David, who was asleep on the couch, where the child was. He told her that Rowan had supposedly gone to a friend's house, but he couldn't say whose. Colleen wanted to call the police right away, but David insisted that Rowan was just with people they knew and would be back soon. So Colleen stayed home with him for a few more hours, waiting, hoping the phone would ring, hoping someone would call and say that Rowan was safe, but no call ever came. The silence just made everything feel heavier, more frightening. Eventually, they started searching the nearby area themselves, but nothing came of it. At 6:50 in the evening, Rowan was officially reported missing. An Amber Alert was activated, and almost immediately, a large-scale search began, with many residents of Stella joining in. The entire community came together, trying to help however they could. When a child goes missing, every single minute matters. Time kept slipping by. To understand what had happened to Rowan, investigators needed to reconstruct the events of that night. They had to figure out where she was, who she was with, and most importantly, who saw her last. Her mother was working the night shift at Walmart, so Rowan had been left in the care of her stepfather, David. David told investigators that on the evening of November 2nd, he supposedly left the house to hang out with friends, Christopher and Nathan. According to him, Rowan stayed home because she had already fallen asleep on the floor in her bedroom. He claimed he returned around midnight, but didn't check on her. Later, his story began to change. He eventually told investigators that he actually left the house again at around 1:30 in the morning. He called his mother and asked to borrow her SUV. She said she was watching television at the time, waiting for him to come back. She also did not check on Rowan's whereabouts. For investigators, the story was starting to raise more and more unanswered questions. David did not openly cooperate with the investigation and couldn't clearly explain where he was that night or why he had been away from home for several hours. He admitted that leaving the child without proper supervision was a serious mistake, and said he didn't initially tell investigators because he was afraid it would make him look suspicious. Rowan's disappearance wasn't reported until roughly 8 to 10 hours after she was already gone. "We noticed that discrepancy right away," said the sheriff of Newton County, Chris Jennings. His version of events changed several times, and during our checks, we kept finding major inconsistencies. To better understand what really happened, investigators needed to speak with Nathan and Christopher and see whether their accounts lined up. An investigator met with Nathan, who said that earlier that evening, the three of them, himself, Christopher, and David, met at the farm where they worked. After that, they went to a store to buy alcohol, and later headed to a place where they planned to hang out and play pool. Colleen left for work around 8:30 in the evening. Later that same night, Christopher asked Nathan to give him a ride home, and David went with them, once again leaving Rowan alone in the house without any adult supervision. When they arrived at Christopher's trailer, the group continued drinking. Along the way, more alcohol was purchased, and according to Nathan, they also used marijuana. About an hour later, Nathan and David headed back. Nathan chose to take back roads instead of the highway because he didn't want to draw the attention of law enforcement. He dropped David off at his home and then returned to his own place around midnight. David's friend, Christopher Collings, who had been with him on the night Rowan was last seen, also spoke with the sheriff's deputies. Overall, he backed up Nathan's version of events, though he didn't mention anything about marijuana use. Christopher said he stayed at his trailer and went to sleep, and that he had no further contact with David after that. He claimed he had no idea Rowan was missing. The next day, FBI agents officially joined the investigation, while the community of Stella continued searching non-stop. Dozens of officers from 3 different counties worked together with around 50 specialists, along with the Missouri State Highway Patrol and the FBI. At the same time, sheriff's deputies kept speaking with David again and again, trying to piece everything together. FBI specialists seized David's vehicle, as well as his mother's vehicle, the one he had borrowed that night. Around that same time, deputies from Newton County went to Christopher's workplace and asked him to answer some additional questions. Christopher agreed to keep cooperating and voluntarily came to the sheriff's office. He also consented to a polygraph test and a computer voice stress analysis, or CVSA, a system that analyzes speech patterns to help assess truthfulness. Christopher insisted he had no information about Rowan's whereabouts and even offered that same day to help with the search efforts. That day, the police chief of Wablo, Clinton Clark, was in town on routine patrol. Chief Clark had known Christopher for about 17 years. They had a trusting relationship, and Christopher had turned to him for support in the past, especially during a difficult time after his mother passed away. That day, Christopher stopped Chief Clark and told him that Rowan was missing and that he was helping search for her. Chief Clark immediately noticed that Christopher was acting differently than usual. He seemed overly wound up, tense, not like himself. After that conversation, Chief Clark passed the information along to the FBI, saying he had a feeling Christopher might know more than he was letting on. He told them he was willing to help the investigation in any way he could, and the FBI asked him to stay in contact with Christopher. Later on, Christopher told FBI agents that he believed David might be involved in Rowan's disappearance. He even offered to wear a hidden microphone to assist the investigation and shared his own thoughts about possible places where the search should continue. Rowan's disappearance deeply shook this small community and, understandably, left many people scared and disoriented. A school teacher, Tammy Marshall, remembered the last day she saw Rowan, the very same day the girl disappeared. She noticed Rowan needed some basic care, so before classes started, they spent about 30 minutes fixing her hair together, gently brushing it, and putting it up into a neat ponytail. Later that same day, Tammy decided to check on Rowan one more time, just to make sure she was okay. She saw the girl by herself. Rowan ran past her, lightly skipping along. She looked so happy, Tammy remembered. She just passed by like everything in her life was completely fine. At that point, investigators considered David, Christopher, and Nathan as persons of interest, since they were among the last people to have contact with Rowan. Investigators described Christopher as cooperative, visibly concerned, and appropriately behaved. Later that evening, he went to see Colleen to ask how the search was going and to offer whatever help he could. David and Christopher were longtime friends. Earlier that year, Christopher had even lived with the family for several months, staying in the basement of their home. He helped Rowan with her homework, and she called him Uncle Chris. Christopher also had children of his own, 3 kids under the age of 10, who lived with their mother in Arkansas. In October of 2007, Christopher moved to the family farm and began living there in a trailer. 3 days after Rowan was officially reported missing, the investigation's main focus shifted to David Spears. He was questioned repeatedly, and his home had already been thoroughly searched as part of the investigation. That same evening, Christopher went to Chief Clark's office to say that he had been speaking with the FBI and had given agents possible locations to search next. Right away, Chief Clark could sense something was off. Christopher seemed tense on the inside, and his behavior stood out. He looked clearly anxious and avoided eye contact, which was very unlike him. Chief Clark contacted the FBI and shared his observations. Agents believed that if Christopher had any important information and was willing to share it, he would most likely do so in a conversation with Chief Clark. So they asked him to help move things forward, and Chief Clark agreed. On November 7th, Christopher came to the Newton County Sheriff's Department to meet with FBI agents. He agreed to provide a DNA sample and also allowed a search of his residence, as well as a safe that was kept in David's home. During the interview, Christopher told agents that the alibi David had given for the night Rowan disappeared did not line up with the truth. As the interview went on, Christopher grew more and more tense and reacted emotionally to any questions related to the missing child. Eventually, he told the agents that he would stop cooperating if they continued to treat him as a possible participant in whatever happened to Rowan. After that, the interview was brought to an end. Later that same evening, Christopher reached out to Chief Clark again. He was clearly upset about the FBI interview and said he planned to completely shut down and stop talking to anyone about the situation. He also mentioned that he might need to seek legal counsel. Chief Clark explained that he absolutely had the right to an attorney, but he also stressed that if the goal was to find Rowan as quickly as possible, cutting off cooperation with investigators could only make things worse. Christopher said, if there's anything else I need to say, I'll say it to you. Chief Clark understood how critically important it was to follow every procedural rule, so he made sure to clearly remind Christopher of his Miranda rights. After that, Christopher signed a form confirming that he understood those rights and agreed to continue the conversation without an attorney present. Chief Clark explained that he had a strong feeling Christopher was holding back something important, and he asked him directly whether he knew anything about what had happened to Rowan. At that moment, Christopher completely broke down. He started crying and said he would never hurt her, that he truly loved her, from the heart. At that moment, a third person stepped in, and the conversation was cut short. Christopher abruptly stood up and walked away. Chief Clark once again informed the FBI about what had happened, and shared his belief that Christopher was emotionally on edge and would likely seek legal counsel very soon. The following day, Chief Clark spoke in more detail with the FBI about the situation surrounding Christopher Collings, his personal life, and their long-standing relationship. He said he was convinced Christopher knew something important, but for the investigation to move forward, it was probably necessary to first locate Rowan. The FBI agents explained that once Rowan was found, Chief Clark would need to be the one to have the critical conversation with Christopher. And then, the very next day, the case took a major turn, one that confirmed the worst fears of both investigators and the community. Earlier, David and Christopher had worked for the Newton County coroner, Mark Bridges, at his automotive business that serviced official vehicles. Christopher worked as a mechanic, while David had basic repair skills and handled sales. Mark remembered David as someone who could do just about anything that needed to be done. On the day Rowan was officially reported missing, Mark was on call. That was when David contacted him for the first time. "I think he figured I'd worked in law enforcement at some point, and that I could help," Mark later recalled. David kept saying things like, "Maybe she's at a friend's house." Mark said that on November 8th, he spent the entire day with David, trying to figure out where Rowan might be. With the FBI's approval, Mark was fitted with a hidden microphone, and their movements were quietly coordinated from the air. He drove David through different areas, carefully trying to get a sense of where the child might have gone. At one point, Mark suggested a hypothetical situation, asking David to imagine that Christopher might be involved in Rowan's disappearance. "I said, I'd be suspicious of Chris, and if you were in his place, what would you do next?" David went silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "Let's go. Let's check out a few places." They set off to look around, and the first place David took him to was a sunken area in the ground. "What is this place?" Mark asked. "What I saw raised immediate red flags for me," Mark recalled. "At that point, I wasn't sure what it meant yet, but David and I talked about it right there. I really wanted to check that cave, and on some subconscious level, I think David did too. He didn't bring me there by accident." After that, the FBI contacted the McDonald County Sheriff's Office. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, Deputies Mike Hall and Jake B.S. headed out to the site to carry out a search. About 20 feet underground, on a narrow ledge, they made the heartbreaking discovery. It was the child everyone had been searching for days. The moment confirmed what people had been afraid to say out loud, and, honestly, it just stopped everything cold. "I wasn't there at the exact moment the discovery was made, but based on all the circumstances, it was clear to us that this was a criminal act," said Newton County Sheriff Chris Jennings. When the medical examiner's report came back, it confirmed that Rowan had been subjected to a severe violation of her personal safety, and that the cause of her death was a lack of air. Specialists also noted signs that she had been kept in harsh conditions for an extended period, along with minor injuries that occurred before her death. Separately, it was stated that injuries to her face were likely the result of falling into the sinkhole. When Chief Clark heard the news on November 9th that Rowan had been found, he was also told by his office that Christopher was nearby and trying to reach him. Chief Clark immediately notified the FBI, and they advised him to locate Christopher as quickly as possible and officially inform him that Rowan had been found. At first, though, they couldn't reach him. Not long after that, the phone rang. It was Christopher. He asked if he was being watched, specifically whether a grey minivan he thought he'd noticed belonged to the police. Chief Clark told him he had no knowledge of any surveillance. Christopher explained that he felt scared and extremely on edge, and had been driving around the area without any real destination. Chief Clark suggested he come to the station, but Christopher asked to meet in person first. During that meeting, Christopher agreed to ride with Chief Clark in a patrol car to the police department. "Well," Chief Clark said, "it's over. Rowan was found this morning." At those words, Christopher's eyes filled with tears, and he lowered his head. At first, Chief Clark believed that David might have played the central role in what happened, and that Christopher knew about it. He pressed him, asking him to tell the truth. Christopher looked at him in surprise. Because there were a lot of people at the station, he didn't want to talk in front of anyone else. So they decided to drive to Muni Bridge, a few miles outside of Wooblow. Chief Clark informed his colleagues ahead of time about the route. When they arrived at the bridge, Christopher extended his hands, as if expecting to be restrained. He was told there was no need for that. "For what I'm about to say, it is," he replied. They sat down on the slope near the bridge, and Christopher began telling the same version of events he had repeated over the past week, up until the moment when Nathan and David left his trailer. He confirmed that back roads were used to avoid possible trouble with law enforcement because of the driver's condition. He said he realized that if he acted quickly, he could get back to Rowan and take her away before Nathan and David got onto the highway, since that was the shortest and fastest route. Before long, he was back at the house. He went inside, stepped into the bathroom, then into Rowan's bedroom. There, he carefully lifted her off the floor and carried her outside while she was still asleep, then placed her in his truck. According to him, Rowan was still sleeping when they reached the trailer. He carried her inside and tried not to speak so she wouldn't hear or recognize his voice. After the serious violation of her personal safety, he claimed he intended to take Rowan back home, holding her by the hands and guiding her in a way that she wouldn't see his face. But at some point, she turned around and recognized him. She realized it was the same person who had helped her with homework and whom she knew as Uncle Chris. He said he panicked and froze. Near the house, there was a rope-like item in the truck, which he used, leading to the tragic end of Rowan Ford's life. He understood the seriousness of what had happened and placed her body in the bed of his vehicle. At first, he considered leaving her near Muni Bridge, but decided against it, fearing she would be discovered quickly there. He drove around for a while, trying to figure out where to leave her, and eventually chose the area near Fox Cave. There, he threw her into the sinkhole and tried to cover the opening with branches, but the hole was simply too large. After that, he returned home. When he arrived, he said he noticed marks on his clothing and on the mattress. He gathered Rowan's personal belongings, some household items, the rope, and his own clothes, and put them all into a wood-burning stove, trying to destroy any possible evidence. The mattress, he said, was rolled up and placed into a metal barrel. I thought a fire would be too noticeable and might draw attention, he said. After that, he moved the barrel into a shed and set it on fire. What he described was incredibly heavy to hear, and realizing the amount of suffering Rowan had endured made the whole tragedy feel even more painful, honestly almost unbearable. Afterward, Chief Clark returned with Christopher to the police department, so other law enforcement officers could also hear his statement. His rights were read to him again, and he repeated his account to deputies from Barry County and Newton County who were present along with FBI agents. He also gave written consent for searches of his property. He was then transported to the Barry County Sheriff's Department, where he gave another statement, this time recorded on video. He added that throughout that entire day he had been in an extremely emotional state, crying a lot, and said he felt deep remorse for what had happened. Law enforcement officers were stunned by the confession. Up until that point, they had believed David played the central role in the tragedy, and that Christopher may have only had certain information. But once these new details emerged, investigators spoke with David again, and this time his statements made the situation even more complicated. David claimed that he went into the house, checked Rowan's bedroom, and saw that she wasn't there. According to him, he immediately realized that Christopher had taken the child. He said he drove to Christopher's place and, by his own account, encountered a serious violation of the child's safety there. David stated that he himself was also involved in improper actions. Realizing how serious the situation was and what the consequences could be, he said they both became involved in events that ended with Rowan's life being taken, after which her body was left in a sunken area. At first, David had said he was simply driving around the area. Now, investigators understood that, according to his version, the body had been moved from the original location. During questioning, David also claimed that the rope-like item was given to him by Christopher, and that Christopher was the one who actually ended Rowan's life. I realized at that moment that something irreversible had happened, he said, according to the official interrogation record. I understood that she was gone. Investigators then spoke with Christopher again and presented him with David's version of events. Christopher firmly insisted that David was not involved in either the tragedy itself or what happened afterward. Investigators now faced an extremely difficult situation. Two men were giving contradictory confessions. Each admitted some level of involvement while completely denying the other's participation. It made the case even more tangled and confusing. Partly based on Christopher's statements, an affidavit submitted by Barry County Sheriff Mick Epperson to the prosecutor stated that serious criminal violations against a child had taken place. At the same time, it was not yet possible to definitively determine who had carried out the specific actions that led to Rowan's death. David Spears and Christopher Collings have been formally charged with multiple serious offences, including grave sexual crimes against a child and the crime that led to Rowan's tragic death, Sheriff Mick Epperson of Barry County said. I expect prosecutors will also file charges against Christopher related to the unlawful transportation of a child, but not against David, since he was legally considered her guardian. Both men were taken into custody without the possibility of bond and placed in the Barry County Jail. Later, David's mother spoke with him at the detention facility, and according to her, he again admitted involvement, saying he had been in a severe psychological breakdown which caused parts of that night to feel like they were missing from his memory and only started coming back later. "He's my only one," she said through tears. All of this completely broke him. He really was attached to Rowan. Meanwhile, Christopher's brother, Greg, publicly expressed disbelief in the accusations. "I don't believe he could have been involved in something like this," he said. "He has 3 kids of his own."
The two appeared in court in Cassville in Berry County, Missouri. The two were arrested on Monday, 3 days after Rowan Ford's body was found about 10 miles from her home. According to investigators, both men have admitted taking part in the crime, but today in court entered pleas of not guilty. Today, Spears and Collins were heavily guarded, wearing both wrist and leg shackles. Ford's mother, Colleen Spears, was also in court today, joined by several family members. While many in the community of Stella continue to grieve and hope for justice, they did not attend court proceedings this morning.
I wanted to, but my heart wouldn't let me. I didn't want to go over there and look at those 2 guys.
On November 27th, Colleen filed for divorce from David. The town's mayor said she was in an extremely fragile emotional state and simply wasn't ready to speak with the media. "She looks kind of numb," he said. "She tries to keep herself busy all the time. Right now, she's sitting at a sewing machine making items for her child's farewell service." On the morning of the school memorial, a pink dogwood tree was planted in Rowan's honor. Her classmates released balloons into the sky, each with handwritten notes attached. An angel figure was also placed there, symbolizing both her birthday and the day she was found. More than 300 people gathered for the memorial service at Gospel Lighthouse Church. During the ceremony, Rowan's favorite hymn, "The Old Rugged Cross," was played. The pastor spoke to the community, urging everyone not to let hatred and anger take over after the devastating loss of Rowan. Both David Spears and Christopher Collings later publicly maintained their innocence. A judge ruled that Christopher's case would move forward to trial, finding there was sufficient evidence to proceed. Because of intense public attention and heavy media coverage, David's attorneys requested that his trial be moved from Barry County to Pulaski County, and that request was granted. Since David and Christopher were facing separate trials, this made a change of venue possible. Due to how complex the case was, several years passed before full court proceedings could actually begin. Then came unexpected developments. After consultations with the Attorney General's office, and in light of new findings from an independent laboratory, the most serious charges against David Spears were dropped. A plea agreement was reached with the Barry County prosecutor, Johnny Cox. In the end, David was sentenced to 4 years in prison for obstructing the investigation and 7 years for endangering the welfare of a child. Those were the maximum sentences allowed for those charges. The prosecutor noted that this decision was extremely difficult, especially considering David's early statements after his arrest, in which he suggested he may have been involved in the tragic events, even if things later became far more complicated. "This case has almost completely consumed the resources of my office over the past 4 years and 10 months, he said. Throughout that entire time, it remained an active investigation. Every piece of available evidence was carefully reviewed to determine whether Mr. Spears was involved in serious offences against Rowan Ford, with the sole exception of Mr. Spears' own statements. And over all those years, no additional evidence was ever found that confirmed his involvement in what happened. The test results and forensic findings didn't point to David being involved, and the data simply didn't line up with his initial statements. Among the materials reviewed was the evidence kit collected during the autopsy. It was analysed by the State Police Laboratory, then by the FBI lab, and later by an independent laboratory. According to Cox, it was the independent lab's findings that matched Christopher's version of how events unfolded that night. Cox also pointed out major inconsistencies in David's claims, that he was the one who caused Rowan's death. The lack of solid physical evidence that could actually hold up in court created serious doubts about how reliable David Spears' interrogation statements really were. He added that Christopher consistently denied anyone else's involvement in the events that led to Rowan's death, both during his first interview and his final one. In every statement he gave to law enforcement, Christopher Collings insisted that he acted alone and took full responsibility for what happened to Rowan Ford, Cox emphasized. According to Cox, the core problem was this. In court, prosecutors would have had to present Christopher's version as a complete and accurate reconstruction of that night, while at the same time introducing David's statements and arguing that those were true too. even though the two versions directly contradicted each other. That's a pretty impossible position to be in, you know. Another serious risk was that if David were convicted on more severe charges, it could later open the door to appeals and possibly even undermine the case against Christopher. Cox stressed that none of those outcomes were acceptable for the state. An event of this magnitude should outrage everyone, he said. I was shocked when I first learned about it, but as a prosecutor, I'm obligated to act strictly within the law, guided by facts, fairness, and professional integrity. Sheriff Robert M. Evanson said he believed Cox's decision was justified. There was no physical evidence that would have allowed us to prove David Spears' guilt in court, he said. So as difficult as this decision was, the prosecutor did what he had to do. Evanson also added that Christopher consistently maintained he acted alone, and that all available evidence pointed to Collings as the primary individual responsible. By contrast, Spears' confessions, while similar in some ways, contained numerous inconsistencies when compared to the physical evidence, which instead pointed toward Christopher. But it still leaves a lot of unanswered questions, Evanson said. Why would someone voluntarily confess to involvement in something this horrific? That's what the public keeps asking, and to this day, there's no truly convincing explanation. I support the prosecutor's decision. I had serious doubts about whether David was even guilty at all. I understood how incredibly complex this case was, and that there was a very real risk he would be acquitted. Later on, Christopher Collings filed a motion to suppress evidence, attempting to block all of his statements made during the investigation, along with materials seized from his property, his trailer, his truck, and his biological samples, from being used in court. The judge denied that motion. Christopher Collings' trial lasted about a week. During the proceedings, his defense attorneys argued that Christopher suffered from deep psychological issues and was unable to form healthy emotional connections due to severe parental neglect and traumatic experiences in foster care. He was the youngest of 6 children, all of whom had entered the foster system during childhood because of their parents' criminal behavior and substance abuse problems. As an adult, Christopher became a father himself, but his struggles with alcohol and drug addiction seriously complicated his life. During the trial, the defense also emphasized that Christopher supposedly did not intend for Rowan's life to end. His attorneys urged the jury to set aside the emotionally disturbing images from the scene and the autopsy, as well as the child's age, and instead focus strictly on the law and the factual circumstances of the case, which they argued showed no evidence of deliberate planning.
Took her back outside, still no clothing on from the waist down.
How painful would that injury have been?
Very painful.
One of the people who took the stand during the trial was Colleen, Rowan's mother. What impact did it have on you when you learned about your daughter's tragic death? The prosecutor asked. It completely broke me and my other children, she said. Rowan's sister also testified, saying that when she heard what had happened, she literally lost all strength and collapsed onto the floor. She explained that the entire family was left in a state of deep emotional exhaustion and a long, crushing psychological decline. Eventually, this incredibly difficult and emotionally charged trial finally came to an end, and the jury returned its verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Christopher Collings, guilty of murder in the first degree.
Because this case involved the possibility of the harshest possible punishment, the sentencing phase was absolutely critical. During that stage, the prosecution presented 6 victim impact statements from people close to Rowan, each one describing how these events had shattered their lives. Christopher's defense called 2 witnesses who suggested that David may have had some level of involvement in what happened to Rowan. A human development expert also testified, explaining that Christopher had suffered severe emotional neglect during the first 6 months of his life, which significantly affected his psychological development. According to the expert, Christopher showed deep impairments in forming healthy relationships, later linked to diagnoses involving disorganized attachment and episodes of uncontrolled emotional outbursts. After this phase concluded, the jury came back with a recommendation for the harshest sentence allowed by law. From there, the case moved into a long series of appeals. Christopher's attorneys filed an appeal of his sentence with the Supreme Court of Missouri. Under Missouri law, appeals like this are automatic in cases involving the most severe possible punishment. In the year 2014, that appeal was denied. After that, Christopher made another attempt to challenge the sentence, asking for it to be reduced to life in prison instead. That request was also denied. He then filed a writ of habeas corpus with the Supreme Court of Missouri. If that effort had succeeded, it could have opened the door to arguments that the state had failed to disclose information about the past of one of the key witnesses, Woblo Police Chief Clinton Clark, specifically related to his military service during the Vietnam War. Prosecutors responded by saying that even if that information had been disclosed, it would not have changed the final outcome of the case. While the appeals were ongoing, another question came up, one a lot of people were asking quietly. Whatever happened to David Spears? He spent more than 7 years in prison and was released in the year 2015. Shortly after his release, but before his probation period officially ended, he found a job. He was hired by the husband of the attorney who had represented him during his criminal case. David went on to work at the Missouri Public Defender's Office. He stayed there for 1 year and 8 months until his probation was completed. That same public defender's office had previously provided legal representation to both Christopher and David. Later on, Christopher's attorneys argued that this created a potential conflict of interest, one that, in their view, deprived their client of the opportunity to plead guilty to lesser charges. One defense attorney acknowledged that a possible conflict existed, but said it was never disclosed to the court or to Christopher himself, either because of divided loyalties or fear of how Mr. Collings might react. As a result, Christopher only learned about these concerns after all sentencing procedures had already been completed. A petition for clemency was later filed on Christopher's behalf. It argued that he had a congenital brain abnormality that affected how he perceived reality, how he evaluated situations, and how he made decisions. The petition also stated that he himself had suffered serious violations of personal boundaries during childhood. According to those filing the petition, the combination of these factors resulted in a deeply traumatized individual who lacked the ability to fully adapt to adult life. The clemency request also emphasized that David Spears likely falsely incriminated himself. In the record of his interrogation, it was noted that he told law enforcement the rope-like item had been given to him by Christopher and that he described the events that followed as the result of an intense psychological state, rather than deliberate, conscious actions.
The Missouri Supreme Court sets an execution date for a man accused of raping and murdering a 9-year-old girl in southwest Missouri. In 2012, a jury convicted Christopher Collings of the 2007 abduction, rape, and murder of Rowan Ford of Stella, Missouri. Investigators say Collings threw Ford's body into a sinkhole in McDonald County. The Supreme Court today set his execution for December 3rd.
Christopher Collings' fate was finally sealed after the United States Supreme Court declined to hear his appeal and Missouri Governor Mike Parson denied clemency. Parson, who had previously worked as a sheriff and oversaw the execution of 12 death sentences during his time in office, had never once granted clemency. Christopher's execution was scheduled for December 3rd, 2024. The sentence was to be carried out using the state's legally prescribed procedure involving the sedative pentobarbital. Several people involved in the investigation, including Newton County Sheriff Chris Jennings, said this ending felt long overdue. "I had hoped the state would make this decision while I was still in office," he said. "I submitted a request to be present at the execution. For me, it just felt like the right thing to do. First and foremost, for Rowan." He also acknowledged that the case would never truly feel resolved. "I wish more could have been done, and that every part of this case had reached a full conclusion," he said. "But this is how it unfolded. We've waited a very long time. I'm relieved that a date was finally set." On the day Christopher's sentence was carried out, at 5:54 in the evening, all witnesses were brought into designated viewing rooms. Among them were 4 members of his legal team, 4 media representatives, 8 official witnesses representing the state, and 2 members of Rowan's family. At 6 o'clock sharp, Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey formally notified the Department of Corrections that there were no legal barriers preventing the execution from moving forward. 9 minutes later, 49-year-old Christopher Collings was officially pronounced deceased, marking the completion of the sentence. Before the execution, Christopher left behind a written statement that was read afterward. It said, "Whether this is right or wrong, I accept this situation for what it is. To everyone I have hurt in this life, I ask for forgiveness. I hope you are able to find peace within yourselves and move forward, no matter which side of this tragedy you are on. You are all in my prayers, and I hope to see you in heaven someday. After the procedure was over, Sheriff Chris Jennings said that, in his view, the system ultimately failed to fully protect Rowan. Sadly, there were warning signs that, he began pausing. He explained that numerous calls had come in to hotlines about the child's situation, but law enforcement was never properly brought in. I want to believe that we would have stepped in and removed her from those dangerous conditions if we had been fully aware, he said. This case does bring some sense of closure, I guess. There is a form of justice here. It's not complete justice, but it's what we have left to accept.
It's one of those cases that you never forget.
Mick Epperly says the case sent shockwaves through southwest Missouri.
It's just terrible. And someone to take a life and throw them down into a cave like a piece of dirt, it's terrible.
Do you feel like justice has been served with this?
I think it has. She didn't deserve any of this. It'll give some satisfaction to the family that maybe he got what he deserved.
For so many people involved in this case, it will always be a part of their lives. Sheriff Jennings said it was an incredibly heavy case. Over 44 years of service, working countless investigations involving tragic loss of life, this one affected him more deeply than any other. I have Rowan's school ID, he said. I've carried it in my pocket ever since everything happened, and I still carry it today. He explained that this case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches investigations involving children's safety. In Newton County, we deal with a lot of cases involving child neglect and abuse, he said. A child's safety is always the absolute top priority. Intervening in families is never easy, but if there's even the slightest doubt, we act. We never forget this case. The impact of Rowan's death could still be felt throughout her community. One of her teachers, Todd Holt, who testified during the trial, admitted that for a long time he couldn't bring himself to clear her desk in the classroom. She was the kind of kid every teacher hopes for, he said. She came to school focused, motivated, and she genuinely wanted to make something of her life. Rowan's best friend was a boy named Tyler. His mother remembered that the two of them were almost always together, and that Rowan's calm, quiet nature somehow perfectly balanced her son's high energy. It was the closest thing to losing my own child that I can even imagine, she said. My son couldn't sleep alone for a long time after that, and even now he still talks about her. For Rowan's older sister, the love and memory of her never faded. I'm incredibly proud of the girl she was becoming, she said. A part of me left with my sister,